Okay, now we're on to fatigue. So basically, if our energy systems run out of fuel, they aren't going to be able to produce ATP and we will feel fatigued. So fuel depletion can refer to the depletion of any of the fuels used by the energy systems. So for the ATP PC system, fuel depletion refers to the depletion of ATP stored at the muscles, which takes around 2 to 3 seconds, followed by the depletion of PC, which takes around 10 to 15 seconds. So after these fuels are depleted, the anaerobic glycolysis system will have to be used more heavily, likely resulting in more fatigue. I recently moved rurally from med school, and I feel like the air is just drier here, and I get really dehydrated more easily. I don't really know if I'm making that up or if that's real, but that's what I'm feeling. Okay. So, depletion. Fuel depletion means that we can't produce ATP and we'll feel fatigued. So, yeah, for ATP PC system, fuel depletion means that we've lost the ATP and PC there, and so we've got to wait a little while in order to replenish these stores. I did mention before that we can replenish these stores by waiting 3 minutes, and this will replenish about 97%. Sorry, 3 minutes is about 97% replenishment of phosphocreatine. Another source of fatigue is the buildup or accumulation of metabolic byproducts. And so the buildup of these metabolic byproducts is a source of fatigue for the two anaerobic energy systems. So increased ADP, which is adenosine diphosphate, and inorganic phosphate or PI levels, which are caused by the breakdown of ATP. And these reduce muscle contraction force and therefore cause fatigue. Lactic acid, we know can cause fatigue, sort of. Like I mentioned before, that it's not the lactic acid itself which is the contributor to fatigue, but rather the hydrogen ions which are associated with it. So as we saw earlier, lactic acid accumulates when an athlete works above their lactate inflection point. Remember that lactate inflection point is the last point at which lactate entry and removal into the blood balance. After this point, it will start increasing. So lactic acid then breaks down to lactate and hydrogen ions. The hydrogen ions make the muscle acidic and cause fatigue. Lactate levels are a good indicator of fatigue, but don't actually cause fatigue. Lactate can actually be used by the liver to produce more glucose, which can then be used for fuel. Another source of fatigue is actually elevated body temperature. So all the chemical reactions that occur in our muscles can cause heat to be released. And this can cause our body temperature to increase, particularly on a hot day. So I kind of touched on this before. So imagine you're out running, you're starting to overheat. I overheat really easily, like when I start running. So my body temperature is starting to increase. So my core body temperature is increasing or overheating during physical activity. And as a result, my body's like, oh no, homeostasis. I need to restore my body back to its kind of regulated state. And so what happens is that it sends more blood to the skin in order to help us sweat and cool the body down. And so it rediverts blood flow to the skin. So you've got vasodilation going to the skin and vasoconstriction going to muscles away from the skin. So we really want to redirect the blood, make the pipes of blood going toward our skin a lot bigger, right? And so it sends more blood to our skin. We'll start to have evaporation there, and we'll have loss of plasma, and this will cool down the body. So while this is effective at cooling down the body, it actually means that less blood and therefore less oxygen ends up flowing to the working muscles. Because what is the point of blood? Why do we have blood? It's to get the oxygen to our working muscles, right? And we get that oxygen to our working muscles so that we can work aerobically. If we're overheating though, we've got to redirect that blood to cool us down. So we redirect the blood to our skin, evaporate it to cool us down, but it means that the blood and thus the oxygen is not going to the muscles, but rather to the skin. Therefore, we actually have to produce more energy anaerobically, and then we have to rely on the anaerobic glycolysis system. And so we know that the anaerobic glycolysis system produces lactic acid, which is then converted to lactate and associated with those hydrogen ions, which are quite fatiguing. And so kind of have a chain reaction of events which leads to more anaerobic energy production and causes more fatigue. So you can kind of see that elevated body temperature is kind of a cause of fatigue in the aerobic system. But the reason it's a cause of fatigue is not because of the aerobic system itself, but rather because overheating means we've got to redirect blood flow, and that blood's not going to our working muscles, so we're forced to work anaerobically, and hence fatigue anaerobically. That makes sense? Maybe reread that a few times to try and work through it in your head, and you'll see that it's really the anaerobic system at fault here. very thirsty. I'm going to have more water. Okay, so I've got a nice summary table here, kind of identifying the likely cause of fatigue associated with each energy system. Let me just have my water. So regarding the ATP-PC system, the most likely cause of fatigue is fuel depletion. So we've lost phosphocreatine and ATP. So we've only got a little bit stored at the muscles to supply the muscles instantly. With the anaerobic glycolysis system, we've got accumulation of metabolic byproducts, including hydrogen ions, inorganic phosphate, and adenosine diphosphate. And regarding the aerobic system, we've got fuel depletion. So we've got loss of glycogen and fats, and we also have elevated body temperature, which just leads to increased reliance on the anaerobic system, which I just touched on. Okay, on to recovery, and then we'll look at acute responses, which is like our second part. So we'll look at two types of recoveries, active recoveries and passive recoveries. So an active recovery involves performing reduced intensity activities at the end of a training session. So you might have a really intense game of footy, you might have an active recovery afterward, and it might be something like slowly jogging around the sports oval or walking around for a bit. A passive recovery, on the other hand, involves sitting still or standing still. As I mentioned before, a phosphocreatine replenishment requires a passive recovery, which is the most effective. So 70% of PC stores can be replenished after 1 minute of passive recovery, and about 98% can be restored after 3 minutes. So if you have just run 100 meters, you're probably going to be using up all your PC stores because it's only there for about 10 to 15 seconds, remember. You want to restore your PC stores. What you want to do is do a passive recovery. And so you kind of sit or stand still for a total of 3 minutes. And this replenishes about 98% of your PC. You kind of keep sitting still for a bit longer and hopefully replenish 100% of it. The type of recovery, though, does depend on the activity that you just conducted and the energy system which was most predominantly used during the activity you just conducted. So, as I mentioned before, the ATP-PC system requires a passive recovery in order to replenish that phosphocreatine. The other two systems, however, the anaerobic glycolysis system and the aerobic glycolysis system, these actually require an active recovery. So, I don't think I discussed more about this. I would just discuss it out loud. So the ATP-PC system produces energy at a very rapid rate and is used for activities of a high intensity. We need to undergo a passive recovery in order to replenish the PC stores. The anaerobic glycolysis system produces fatigue-causing byproducts. So as I mentioned before, the anaerobic glycolysis system breaks down glycogen into glucose. This glucose breakdown, or this respiration breakdown, this respiration actually leads to a byproduct called pyruvic acid being produced. And in the case of anaerobic respiration or the anaerobic glycolysis system, we actually have that pyruvic acid being broken down into lactic acid and thus lactate. And this lactate is actually associated with those hydrogen ions. How do we get rid of these hydrogen ions? Your body will actually just metabolize it eventually, but it does take a while. And so in order to actually cycle out this hydrogen ions, you need to undergo an active recovery. And so just walking around the oval for a bit or doing a lap around the oval, like a slow jog, something like that, this is an active recovery, and this will allow us to cycle out those metabolic fatiguing byproducts. The aerobic system also requires us to undergo an active recovery, probably because you've actually relied quite heavily on the anaerobic glycolysis system if you're starting to use the aerobic system predominantly. So you actually probably do have quite a bit of accumulation of those metabolic fatiguing byproducts here, and so you do want to cycle them out by undergoing an active recovery. So, especially if you have an elevated body temperature, because if you know that if you do have an elevated body temperature, you've actually got that rediversion of blood to the skin, and therefore increased reliance on the anaerobic system, and therefore increased production of those hydrogen ions and inorganic phosphates and ADP, and these do need to be cycled out metabolically, and an active recovery can assist with that.